Hello, this is Brian Otten of Apologetics315. Today I am speaking with Alan Shlemon. Alan is a Christian apologist, a speaker, and trainer working with the organization Stand to Reason. Alan is a skilled communicator on a number of different topics in defending the faith, and he is also passionate about equipping believers to be more confident ambassadors for Christ. We'll find out more about his work in this interview, and I hope to gain some insight into some of the different areas of Alan's expertise. So thanks for joining me today, Alan.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm looking forward to talking about some of these issues.
Now, first off, would you mind telling our listeners a bit about your background and what got you started into the area of defending the faith?
Well, that has primarily to do with my testimony. I had grown up as a Christian in a Christian home. My Christian parents taught me about Christianity. But there was a time when we moved to England, and we were living there, and we didn't get really plugged into a church. And that was about my high school years. And it was about high school time when I started asking myself the question, do I really believe in Jesus Christ because of my own convictions, or is it because I'm just simply basing my convictions and belief on my parents' faith? And at the same time, a lot of people were challenging me. I was going to a secular school there, and a lot of people were asking questions about Jesus and whether there's any real reason to believe in him. And frankly, I had no training in kind of answering those questions. So my answer was, yeah, you're right. There's no real good reason to believe in Jesus. And so I ditched my faith in high school. And then when I came back to the States and went to college, I, for the most part, lived my life for myself. And it was at Cal State Long Beach, where a Christian professor, he was an anatomy professor there, I was doing research for him. And he started to challenge me and say, hey, I heard you were a Christian. What's going on with that? And I said, well, I used to be, but I don't believe in it anymore because there's no reason to. So he said, well, would you consider some evidence if I was to provide you with some? And I said, well, sure, but, you're not going to find anything. And so over the next year, he presented me with all sorts of reasons and Christian philosophers and Christian thinkers and, encouraged me to attend various Christian apologetic events. And after about a year of that, I was so overwhelmed with reasons why I should reconsider Christianity that I committed my life back to Christ. And as a result of that experience, I thought to myself, you know what? The church really needs to be equipped and trained in apologetics because of the very reason why I sort of fell away from the faith. And that was, I was never trained to be able to handle these questions. And no one taught me these things, and there was nobody I could go to as a resource. And so my desire then was to say, hey, let's go back into the church and equip the church to be able to deal with these things so that there's less casualties like me. And that's sort of what got me into apologetics and defending the faith, which caused me to want to study it and learn about it.
Huh. Now, what brought you to be part of Stand to Reason, which is Greg Koukl's apologetics ministry, and what's your role there?
Yeah, Greg Koukl came and spoke at my church in Los Angeles about, I'd say, 13 years ago. And when I first heard him, I thought to myself, man, I have never heard this kind of stuff. It was so persuasive and clear and powerful. And I said to my wife-to-be at the time, I said, hey, you know what, when we get married, let's volunteer for that organization. Let's support them financially. So we got married, and then virtually the next month we called them up and said, hey, we love what you guys are doing. How can we support you? And actually Greg, interestingly, just called us up that night and said, hey, yeah, we'd love to take your support, of course, and why don't you come on by one of our staff meetings? And so I said, sure. So my wife and I showed up the next week, and immediately we got involved in volunteering for them, and we did that for probably about 6 years, just supporting them in any way possible, financially, working the product department, making phone calls, doing anything that we could, answering emails. And then about 6 years into it, Greg had been mentoring me during this time, and so I was learning a lot about apologetics and Stand to Reason's unique vision for what apologetics would look like. There was a time when Greg had a speaking engagement in which he couldn't attend because of his schedule. So they asked me if I could fill in for him and teach. And so although I was excited about it, I was pretty nervous about it as well. But I went ahead and did it. And that happened a couple of more times. And then eventually Stand to Reason said, hey, look, here's a guy, Alan, who has the same vision as we do with regards to apologetics and Christian teaching and is gifted in this area. So, why don't we have him come on board? And so they offered me a position as a speaker and a writer for them. And that's basically been my position for the last 5 or so years, which has been being a public speaker, teaching, training, and writing on different apologetics issues.
It is a great organization, and I know it's touching a lot of people. Now, as far as the areas that you focus on, there are a few that come to mind for me, and that's the pro-life issue, also Islam, and how Christians can deal also with issues of homosexuality. So I'd like to ask you questions about each of these, but first, would you mind sharing why some of these areas are important for Christians to be equipped to answer?
Yeah, I think it's the combination of 2 reasons that make those issues that you just listed important. And the first one is that they're very difficult issues to be able to persuasively yet graciously discuss with non-Christians. And 2 is that they're issues that our culture often confronts us with and that think that we're backward thinking as issues. So it's a combination of those 2 things. One is it's difficult to speak persuasively and clearly and effectively on it. And the second thing is that it comes up often. In our culture just thinks we're so, got our head in the sand on a lot of these topics. And so for that reason, it's been sort of my specialty or interest to focus on those particular issues because they're so hard to defend. And it's something that I think is the culture looks at us to see how we are going to respond to these because they're so controversial, because they're so emotional. And they want to know, are we going to not only just speak intelligently about it, but are we going to be gracious about these issues as well?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about Islam then. And I would want to point our listeners to this 64-page booklet you've authored called The Ambassador's Guide to Islam. Now, it seems to me that Christians today more than ever should be ready with answers when it comes to Christianity and Islam. So what do you cover in this booklet? What do you think are some of the key tools you would want to equip people with?
Well, I think when it comes to Muslim evangelism, virtually every conversation you have with a Muslim comes down to one issue, and that issue is authority. It's going to be about the Bible versus the Quran. So no matter where you begin with, whatever approach you take when you're talking to a Muslim, you might start talking about whether people have an assurance of salvation. You might be talking about Jesus and the Quran. You might be talking about all different sorts of things. But ultimately, what I find is most conversations come back to this foundational issue of authority, and that is the Bible the Word of God? Is the Quran the Word of God? Are they both or neither of them? And for the Christian, they're going to try to argue the Bible is and the Quran isn't, and the Muslim's going to argue that the Quran is and the Bible isn't, or at least the Bible is corrupted. And so the first half of this book that I wrote is intended to equip Christians with a specific tactic that helps them show that the Quran teaches the Bible's reliable. In other words, if you talk to Muslims, virtually unanimously, Muslims will say the Bible is not reliable. But the Quran actually doesn't say that at all. The Quran teaches that the Bible is reliable. Instead of seeing the Quran as an enemy, we enlist it as an ally to make our case for the true Jesus. Because Muslims view the Quran as the ultimate authority. They see it as an unassailable authority. So by trying to argue that the Quran underscores the reliability of the Bible, we're using an authority in the minds of Muslims that they can't argue with, in a sense. And so we're leveraging their high view of the Quran in order to make our case that the Bible's reliable. And then once we've made the case that the Bible's reliable, it's a lot easier then to point Muslims to the true Jesus that is found in the New Testament, rather than the false Jesus that's found in the Quran. So that's the first half of the book is teaching Christians how to use that specific tactic to make the case of the Bible using the Quran. And then the second half of the book answers frequently asked questions about Islam. So, one of the questions that people always ask me is, well, who speaks for Islam? Is it the American Muslim on the street? Is it Queen Rania of Jordan? Is it a Muslim scholar? Is it a university professor? in Egypt, who speaks for Islam? Because different Muslims say different things about Islam. Different non-Muslims say different things about Islam. How are we to, best figure out who is the true authority on Islamic doctrine? And so I kind of answer that question by pointing people to the fact that there's only three ways, or there's three sources that help you to determine whether a teaching is truly Islamic. And that is, it's found in the Quran, it's found in Hadith teaching, and it's taught in the Sunnah, which is the life example set by Muhammad. So if a teaching is found in those three sources, which are extremely authoritative, then a teaching is truly Islamic. But if it's not, then, it's not. And a lot of people are confused by the mixed messages they hear in culture, because President Bush or President Obama says stuff about Islam and whether it's a peaceful religion or it's not. You hear, news media say things, you hear Muslims say things, and it's just, it's a big mess. You're trying to figure out how to make sense of it. So I try to answer that question. Some of the other frequently asked questions are, is violent jihad a valid Islamic doctrine? What about women in Islam? Are women treated with equal rights? Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? What's the difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims? And so the second half of the book basically answers these different frequently asked kinds of questions about Islam.
Okay, Alan, so sometimes talk about Islam raises the immediate thought of, wow, that's a deep subject. I haven't gone very deep into it. If anything, my understanding of it is shallow. And boy, that's a real turnoff. Is this book actually going to help me, or is it going to confuse me? I mean, how much knowledge does a Christian need about Islam, do you think, in order to be able to engage with confidence?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think it can hurt you to gain more knowledge. I don't think having more knowledge is going to hurt you. But you're right. I guess there is a sense as to what is the minimum amount. The purpose of my book, and if you've actually physically seen it, it's actually a very small and accessible book in the sense that it's not a thorough overview of everything to do with Islam, all the arguments for and against. It's not that at all. In fact, what I've tried to do is to narrow the amount of information you have to just one specific issue, and that is the issue of making your case that the Bible is reliable using Quranic evidence. And so my purpose in doing that is to say, hey, look, you can use whatever approach you want in order to reach Muslims. In other words, use the same approach that you might use with any other non-Christian you have. Try to share with them the truth of Jesus Christ, and how salvation is obtained in Christianity, and all the different sorts of things that you would normally do. But it might be the case you're going to get pushback when you try to substantiate your case from the New Testament. And so that's why I've provided this handy kind of technique or approach to substantiate the reliability of the Bible from the Quran as a way to sort of buttress your entire approach. So, in a sense, you don't have to have a ton of knowledge, but you need to know something about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that this book is small enough and accessible enough that you could read it, in a good, hour or so, the whole thing cover to cover, and get a handy tactic that you can use in actual engagements with people, as well as answer just a few frequently asked questions. And these frequently asked questions in the second half of the book are not long at all. We're talking just a couple of pages to kind of just give you an overview and a feel. So I actually think this is a very handy thing to use in order to kind of get an introduction into Islam. But again, if you know a lot more about Islam, or you've studied more about it, that certainly helps. I don't think it hurts to have more knowledge about it. But the other thing I would say, and this can be applied to any religion, not just Islam, but people say, well, Alan, I have a friend who's a Mormon. What book do you recommend that I read in order to dialogue with my Mormon friend? And here's what I tell them. I said, forget the book. Just go and meet with your Mormon friend and sit down and just ask them questions about their faith and about their religion. And this, I think, accomplishes a couple of things that I think are really helpful. One is it takes the pressure off of you of having to sort of, study a ton of things before you ever talk to your Mormon friend. But two, it allows you to find out specifically their version of Mormonism or Islam or whatever it might be, because every adherent of a faith tradition has their own sort of unique take on their faith. And so by asking them questions about, what they believe and why they believe it, this will actually help them to figure out exactly what it is this person believes about Islam. And so that way you're avoiding straw man arguments by perhaps misrepresenting what they believe and attacking a view that they don't hold. So I think the better approach is, instead of worrying about, getting a whole bunch of books and studying about it, is just build your relationship with these people, whether they're Mormon or whether they're Muslims, and just get to know them, ask them questions about their faith, and they'll tell you exactly what it is they believe and their unique take on it, and you'll be better equipped to respond directly to that person rather than to the generic Muslim or the generic Mormon. So, yes, knowledge is important, and it's always good to have things, and if you want to read books at the same time that you're having these conversations, that's great. I'm not discouraging that at all. But I'm just pointing out that probably the more pointed and directed form of knowledge is just simply going to that actual person, sitting down with them and spending, a few lunches or, a couple of weeks, just getting to know them and their unique take on their faith.
Well, I think that's real helpful, the idea of not being intimidated by what you don't know, but going out and finding out what other people believe. And then what I've found is it's when you have specific things you can come away from a conversation that you want to go research, rather than trying to, as you say, sort of learn it all before you engage. So, excellent. I'll point our listeners to your booklet there as well. Now, I want to move on. I also mentioned that I wanted to ask you about the pro-life issue, and in particular, I want to know more about something you're involved in called a pro-life mission trip. So, from what I understand, this is like a 2 to 4 day training event for getting completely up to speed with pro-life arguments and defending the unborn. So, can you tell our listeners more about these pro-life mission trips?
Sure. I think actually it only needs to be a 2-day training. I mean, that would probably be ideal. You could certainly go more days if you had time, but 2 days would be adequate. But basically what this is kind of like what you said, is a completely immersive pro-life training event. And I don't use the word training in the way it's kind of often thought of. A lot of people say, well, hey, come to this conference and we'll train you on abortion or train you on Islam. And what that really means is they're just going to have you come and you're going to sit and listen to a lecture about Islam or about abortion or, whatever it might be. Now, don't get me wrong, I think those have value in themselves. But when I say training, I'm not just talking about a lecture, but what I'm talking about is, yes, you're going to sit down in one of these pro-life mission trips and learn the absolute best and most powerful arguments that you can learn against abortion. But then we keep going with that. We then take time to actually role play the specific tactics that I teach for the pro-life cause. So you'll role play with people next to you, role play in groups. You'll role play with me. And then I take those people who have now been equipped in this, and this will probably take 6 hours or half a day or so. And then we go off into a downtown area or some populated area, perhaps a university campus. And we have created this, a questionnaire that these now pro-life advocates can go out onto the street corner and engage people who are just walking by and say, hey, you know what, I have a question. I have a questionnaire that I want to ask you about a topic. Would you be willing to answer these questions? They're just simply yes and no questions. And so the students get to interact with real people who end up, some of them being pro-choice advocates, and they get to practice the very techniques that we learned earlier. Moreover, it also provides an opportunity for these people to then watch me engage pro-choicers who are on the street and interact and learn from just simply my model as I engage them. And then it also gives me a chance to watch the people that I've trained interact with other pro-choice people, and then I can offer them feedback and critique. So this is what I mean by training. It's not just a lecture. It's everything about learning the stuff, role-playing it, practicing it with real people who oppose you, allowing me to interact and see what you're doing, and allowing me to give you feedback on how you can improve your techniques. And so when people walk away from these kinds of mission trips, they are thoroughly confident that they can respond to virtually anybody they run into, whether it's friends, family, classmates, whatever it might be. because they've actually already engaged or seen the way they've responded and become more confident in their use of these tactics. So this is what I mean by real training. And I think this is what the pro-life mission trip achieves, is the ability for these people to be very, very well equipped to deal with the abortion issue.
And how many people are usually in attendance at one of these events?
Well, I'd say the average maybe 20 to 30, but you could do it with less people, you could do it with more people, because the training doesn't have any kind of limit or minimum amount. And certainly the activism portion, where you actually go out into the public and engage people, I mean, you could have 5 people doing it, you could have 100 people doing it. It really wouldn't matter. Because obviously there's enough space out there in the world to talk to people. So there's no limit or minimum. But by using this questionnaire, it's a very easy way to get into a conversation about abortion, because simply they're just answering yes or no questions. And oftentimes the people who are being interviewed will say, so what is this all about? Are you guys students? Are you guys part of a conference? And then all of a sudden the conversation jumps away from the questionnaire and gets into the deeper issues of pro-life, pro-choice issues.
So how might a typical interaction go as far as once they stop talking about the questionnaire and start talking about an abortion issue? How does one go about being persuasive in that sort of setting?
Well, the questions are simple yes or no questions. So oftentimes a person will say, no, I don't want to answer the questions because they're about abortion. Some will say, yes, I want to answer them. And they go through and just answer yes or no. And then once the questionnaire is done, that person just says, okay, I'm done, and they leave. But many other times, people will stop in the middle and they'll think about it and they'll ask questions of the pro-lifer who's been trained. Sometimes after the interview, they'll say, so, what are you guys pro-choice? Are you pro-life? Or what? Because usually it's in pairs that we've gone out into the public. So the person will just simply ask, well, what is this all about? Are you guys doing this for a research project? And that gives them a chance to say, hey, no, actually what it is, it's a training program. We're learning about, how to make a scientific defense for the humanity of the unborn. And the person say, scientific defense? Really? What scientific arguments are there? And so of course, the person's been trained on how to respond to these questions. And so they present a scientific case, or they could present a philosophical case, or whatever it might be. And so, these conversations can go into, any direction, but we try to teach our students to stay focused on the one question that matters. And that one question is, what is the unborn? And so we have specific tactics that help people keep the conversation focused on that one question, because I think a lot of people feel like, man, abortion is such a difficult topic. There's so many different tangents your conversation can go on about. And frankly, I don't want to get in a conversation because I don't know how to respond to all those issues. Well, the good news is that our approach is to narrow the conversation to one question, that is, what is the unborn? So we have a tactic that teaches how to narrow it, and then we have a tactic to show how to make the case that the unborn is a full human being from the moment of conception, both using science and philosophy.
Well, I recently saw one of your blog posts at the STR blog where you lay out sort of a flowchart diagram of how to defend against every sort of argument, pro-abortion argument, and it's really detailed and simple, but phenomenal. Would you mind talking just a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That is a flowchart that I developed as I was preparing for a debate against a university professor who was a feminist and a women's rights professor. And as I was trying to think about the possible directions she would go, I sort of flowcharted in my own mind, what are the possible ways any person could defend abortion? And I realized there's only 3 possible kinds of arguments that people are going to offer. The first one is simply they're going to assume that the unborn is not a human being. And probably the vast majority of people who defended abortion defended based on the assumption that the unborn is not a human being. So they'll say, women have a right to choose, or, women shouldn't be forced to bring a child who's unwanted into the world, and all these different things. Well, all of these have a hidden assumption, and that is that the unborn is not a human being. So the first kind of category is to recognize that this is what they're doing, they make action, and to then respond and demonstrate that that's what they're doing. They haven't yet made a case that the unborn is not a human being. And we can, in response, make a scientific defense that the unborn is a human being. So that's one category of defenses that people offer and how to respond. The second category is where they say, well, no, I think the unborn is a human being, but it's not a person. And so while it might be by alignment, it doesn't have rights and privileges and protections that persons have. And in this case, what defenders are doing is they're disqualifying a certain class of human beings from being valuable persons because of arbitrary qualities or characteristics. Characteristics that they somehow believe qualify some human beings as being persons and others as not. And so the second approach, the second category is simply they're basically discriminating against a certain class of human beings, and our response is to respond with a tactic known as the SLED test, which shows that there's only 4 kinds of differences between a born human being and the unborn human being, and that is size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. And an unborn differs from a born human being in only those 4 categories, but none of them are relevant to disqualify the unborn from being a valuable person. You know. So anyways, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but that's the second category. And the third category is the abortion choice advocate will say, yes, it's a human being, and yes, it's a person, but based on a woman's bodily rights, she still has the right to kill her unborn child. And so this third kind of argument, which is more common in scholarly circles, grants both of our premises, and that is that the unborn is a human being and a person who's worthy of protection, but a woman's bodily autonomy and rights trump the rights of the child, and so therefore they can kill him. And so the third category of responses that we can offer as pro-lifers is to, basically respond to these kinds of arguments. One of them is known as Judith Jarvis Thompson's famous violinist argument. And, I don't have to go into a lot of detail about it, but basically if you can go to our website and just find all the blogs I posted, and this one was probably posted, I think, September 30th of 2010, and you'll see that flow chart. You'll even see a video of me explaining how the chart works. So if people are interested, they can go there and check it out. But that's basically what that flow chart does. It just shows that, look, we could virtually answer every defense for abortion by just simply learning 3 kinds of responses. And when I show students this and I teach them in those 3 kinds, they are now equipped to deal with the 100% of every argument they're going to come across. And I see that build tremendous confidence in people who are eager to defend unborn human beings from abortion, because they realize, man, whatever this person's gonna come with me at, I'm prepared for it, because based on this flow chart, everything that I've seen, every defense for abortion is going to be in one of these 3 categories, and I'm ready for all 3. So that's, I think that's the value in seeing that flow chart and kind of reading through it.
Well, excellent. I will definitely have a link to that on the blog post today. Now, if someone wanted to get involved with the pro-life mission trip, what should they do, or how can they get more information?
Well, they can just simply call Stand to Reason and talk to Amy. Amy is who would work with your group or students or class or whatever it might be, and kind of arrange for dates and times and all the logistics. Our phone number is 562-595-7333, and Amy's email address is amy@str.org.
Okay, so let's move on now to the other issue that we were mentioning, and that's the issue of homosexuality. Now, this is, of course, being a growing thing in our culture today. What is the challenge that you think Christians are facing when this issue of homosexuality comes up?
Well, that really depends on the person you're talking to and the specific conversation that comes up, obviously. So there's many different things that are being raised when the issue of homosexuality comes up. I think one of the common questions in a lot of people's minds is, how can you claim as a Christian that you're loving and still be a bigot? And I think the assumption is that as Christians, we're bigots, we're homophobes. We have this irrational fear and hatred towards homosexuals, which it might be the case in some instances, but for the vast majority of Christians that I know, it's not. But nevertheless, that's the perception. I think the other challenge is that people think that Christianity can't be true or credible if it teaches that homosexual behavior is a sin. It just, people think that Christianity is backwards thinking, And so, it really, again, it depends on the conversation and the person you're talking to, because they might be bringing up same-sex marriage. They might be bringing up, the fact that they identify themselves as a gay man or a woman, or they're maybe perhaps just challenging what the Bible says about it. But, the challenges are difficult. It's a very messy issue, and it's not always clear-cut what to do and how to respond. So it is a very, very challenging.
Mm-hmm. In general, what sort of advice would you want to give to someone who, say, has a family member who is following a homosexual lifestyle? Like, what sort of attitude or response would you say that person should have? Well,
there's a number of things I would suggest. Well, one is, and this might seem rather plain and obvious initially, but just treat homosexuals as you would anyone else. In other words, just think about how you behave and interact with other non-Christian friends or family members that you have. And think of homosexuality, or think of that friend or family member that you have in the same way. And I think this will actually goes a long way towards providing a better framework for how to deal with a lot of the questions that people say, well, what should I say to this person? Should I bring up the fact that they're a homosexual and that's a sin? And I ask people, I say, well, when you're talking to other non-Christian friends, do you routinely bring up their sins and point out how they're wrong, with regards to their behavior? They're like, no. I'm like, well, why are you trying to do that with homosexuals? All you'll end up doing is alienating them from you and worsening your relationship. So I tell them, look, don't make homosexuality the issue. If you want to reach out to homosexuals, share with them the gospel. Share with them the truth of Jesus Christ in the same way that you would with other non-Christians. And this is what I mean by treating homosexuals as you would anyone else. Because homosexuality per se isn't the issue for them. It's the fact that they are guilty for sins, some of which, of course, include homosexuality. But they're guilty and, as a result, under judgment, like everyone else is. And what they need is a pardon from God, which, of course, is what God offers through his son, Jesus. And that's the issue. And so the times that I've seen homosexuals eventually come out of living a gay lifestyle is mostly where they have accepted Jesus Christ as their Savior, and then eventually the Holy Spirit comes inside their life and transforms them from the inside out, changes their desires, changes their patterns and their behavior, and eventually they begin living their lives for God, And I think a lot of people expect homosexuals to change first before they can come to church or become a Christian or whatever it might be. And as Greg Kokel often says, he says, God, first catches his fish, then he cleans them, And in the same way, if I even recall my own life, I was living my life as a pagan, I was just doing the worst things. But then eventually I accepted Christ as my Savior, and then eventually the Holy Spirit working inside me changed my desires, changed my habits, changed my behaviors, and I began to become more like his son, Jesus. And so I think that's the same thing that happens with homosexuals. I don't think there's this special way that we have to treat homosexuals. In fact, I think that's precisely the problem, is that we treat them differently, and as a result, they think they're different. They think that their sin isn't just bad, it's the worst. Because oftentimes we say, well, homosexuality isn't just a sin, it's an abomination, it's the chief of all sins. And of course that's not biblical or the case at all. But nevertheless, because we don't treat homosexuals as we would anybody else, we tend to fall into these approaches that treat homosexuals as some sort of unique people, when in reality, they're just committing a sexual sin like others, and we need to treat them in the same way. So I think that's one principle. The other thing I say is, look, try to focus on making a long-term difference and not a short-term statement. And what I mean by that is a lot of times we're faced with a challenging situation. They're saying, hey, you know what? Can we come over for dinner? And you're like, who's we? Like me and my partner, them and their gay partner. And so a lot of parents are like, well, I can't let my son come home to dinner bringing his gay partner. I need to make a stand and let them know that homosexuality is a sin. Now, I'm sympathetic to the fact that communicate what's sin and what isn't. But chances are, if you have a family member who identifies with the gay lifestyle, they know what you think on here, Christian. They know that they think homosexuality is a sin. So instead of trying to feed them with this short-term statement to say homosexuality is a sin, so therefore you're not coming over, they miss out on an important opportunity to have these people come over and for you to then build a relationship that is long-term that will ultimately allow you to have a longer, more profound influence in their life for the duration in which you have a relationship, which is hopefully long. And so I think a lot of people short-circuit their opportunity to have a significant lifetime influence in gay men and women's lives because they're so focused on making that short-term statement, on saying, hey, you know what? Homosexuality is wrong. Did you get that? Okay, let me tell it to you again. Okay, did you forget? Because did you know that it's a sin? And it's like, why? We don't do this with other non-Christians. When we have friends who come over, perhaps they're just boyfriend and girlfriend, we might know that they're engaged in sexual relationship with one another. I'm not like, hey, did you know, by the way, that you guys are fornicating and that's wrong? It's like, we don't do that because we realize we want to have an influence, a relationship with them. And you know what? I'll tell you, of all the opportunities, of all the relationships where I've been, where I've had an influence in a person who's identified as a gay or lesbian, it's always been the case that it was first because I was in a strong friendship with them on some level that allowed me to speak or pour into their life, And so I avoided those short-term opportunities to just simply say, hey, you're wrong, this is sin. And instead I focused on the relationship. And then when the opportunity naturally comes up where the issue might arise, well then, yeah, I'll speak the truth. It's not like I avoid talking about homosexuality. But I don't unnecessarily bring it up such that it eventually wears out the relationship. And I know a lot of parents wrestle with this because they want to tell their kids or their brothers or sisters or whatever it might be the truth. But in reality, they need to first build a relationship with them where they can have an opportunity to say those things, I think. So anyways, that's just a couple of things. But I want to point out, for your listeners, I actually wrote a chapter in a book called Apologetics for a New Generation that was edited by Sean McDowell. And the chapter I wrote is called Homosexuality, Know the Truth and Speak It with Compassion. And it kind of outlines my philosophy about your specific question that you just mentioned, which is how should the church basically respond to homosexuality? And it's actually available for free or at least not the book, but my chapter is available on our website at str.org. So if you just went to our homepage and you just went into the search bar, the Google search bar that's listed on our homepage and typed in homosexuality, truth, and then the word compassion, I'm pretty sure it comes up. And then also we have a student site called strplace.org. Mm-hmm. And there's a parent leader materials. If you click on that parent leaders materials, you can download a PDF version of my chapter on homosexuality, truth, and compassion for free. So if somebody wants to know more about what I just said and sort of my broad principles and specific instances of how to apply those principles, I'd recommend that chapter.
Well, great. I think that's really helpful. Now, I want to shift gears again. But before we do, just as a reminder to our listeners that you speak on these issues of Islam, homosexuality, the pro-life issue. So if people are in your area or want to have you come to their area to speak on these things, they can contact you through the STR website at str.org. Now, along the lines of effective communication, this is obviously a big part of sharing our faith with others or doing apologetics. So when we're interacting with unbelieving friends and we're using, say, STR's ambassador approach, which is a great model, also Greg Kougel's tactics for defending the faith, what do you think is, for you, the biggest thing that you've learned as an apologist about the art of communication?
I would say it's the power of questions, the power of using questions in using apologetics and in evangelism and witnessing in general. And I say that because there's so many different benefits to questions and so many different ways you can apply them. Just for an example, one of the things when I teach on tactics in defending the faith, which is really the art of conversational persuasion, when I teach on this, one of the things that I say is, with questions, you can actually have the ability to choreograph conversations you have with non-believers. And so if you just think about a choreographer for a moment, a choreographer might plan out the way a dancer might, begin on the dance floor and do a twist here and a turn here and then end up on this part of the dance floor, on some other part of the dance floor in a certain position, And so a choreographer kind of has in their mind what those movements are going to look like and where the dancer will end up at the very end. Well, in the same way, if you can learn how to use questions in the way that we do in tactics in defending the faith, you can also choreograph your conversations. And so, for example, many times when I'm talking to non-believers in public or on college campuses, somebody might bring up the issue of the problem of evil and say, I can't believe in God's existence because, evil exists. And as soon as that issue comes up, in my mind, I'm already kind of choreographing where I want the conversation to go. And so I'm going to begin asking this person certain questions that I want to lead them along a certain line of thinking such that they arrive at the other end where they're faced with the reality that the concept of evil doesn't even make sense unless you first believe in God, because God provides an absolute standard of what good is, So I want to bring them to that final place where they're wrestling with that issue. And what I end up doing is using questions to direct the conversation in such a way that they end up over there. And that's what I mean by choreographing these conversations. And it can be very, very powerful because, in essence, you're not just left to, where the conversation might go, and just, hey, I'm just going to throw out some points and say this and that. But instead, you're intentionally trying to direct the conversation. It's not twisting people. It's not, being unfair or illegitimate. You're simply trying to guide them to the truth or to the point that you want to make. And so by using questions, it's not merely that it's an engaging kind of form of conversation, which it is. And it's not merely that it shows people that you respect their ideas and beliefs because you're asking about it, but it's also because it allows you to have really the power of directing conversations in such a way that you can more effectively and clearly make your points and bring them to a certain area where, they can see the truth of the Christian worldview, whatever you might be saying. Mm-hmm. And I find that if you ask people questions, they're far more likely to be convinced of a point you're making than if you just simply tell them, I think pluralism is false. When you make statements, people tend to raise defenses and be more resistant to your ideas. But when you ask a person a question and they begin to think about the answer in their own mind, the ideas become far more real and convincing if it's their own mind that's kind of coming up with the answer than if you just simply tell people what you think is true. And so, the power of questions has been probably the single most powerful, thing that I've learned in terms of the art of communication ever since joining Stand to Reason and seeing its effect when I've taught people to use it.
What kind of steps do you think believers can take to become better communicators or to work on their own communication?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm going to have to toot our own horn in this sense, but the book Tactics in Defending the Faith, which was published by Zondervan, that Greg Kokel, our president, wrote, I think is an excellent tool. I and Greg and Brett also teach on this regularly. Tactics in Defending the Faith is one of the key things that I teach on. It's very, very common and popular subject. I think if apologists can take this material and learn it, in essence, as I said before, it's the art of conversational persuasion. It's the ability to recognize false ways of thinking about things, foolish ways about thinking of things, to be able to express truths in a way that is far more persuasive. So let me just give you an example. One of the tactics that we teach has to do with learning what's called the burden of proof rule. And before I kind of explain that, I first have to just kind of lay out what an argument is. When we think about engaging as apologists with other non-Christians, typically we're trying to offer an argument and we're responding to the arguments that they offer. Well, an argument is a particular kind of thing, and it has really two parts. It has a claim, and it has reasons to back it up. Okay? So an argument is not an argument unless it has both a claim, which is whatever the person is trying to argue, as well as the evidence or reasons to support that claim. Now, the burden of proof is the responsibility that someone has to back up their claim. Right? It's the responsibility someone has to give reasons for what they just claimed. And here's how the burden of proof rule works. The person that makes the claim bears the burden of proof. In other words, if you're talking to somebody and they say, well, I think the Bible is full of contradictions, or I think the Bible has been translated or mistranslated over thousands of years, and you can't know that it's reliable anymore. Well, what's happened here is the person has just made a claim. Now, it's not an argument yet because they haven't provided evidence or reasons for it. And so they need to still give evidence or reasons for it. Now, here's the problem that I see Christians run into. When they're talking to a non-Christian and somebody offers a claim like the Bible's been translated so many times you can't possibly know what it says, instead of enforcing the burden of proof rule and asking that non-believer to give evidence or reasons for that claim, what often happens is the Christian responds by going on the defensive and trying to argue against their claim. But the people haven't made an argument yet. All they've done is offered their opinion. And so the Christian will say, no, the Bible's not unreliable. How could you say that? Look at all the manuscript evidence. And they go on making their job a lot harder than it needs to be. In reality, if somebody offers a claim and not an argument, the proper response, in my opinion, which is much easier and I think more powerful, is to simply ask the question, how did you come to that conclusion? You're just asking them why. You're asking them, you're enforcing the burden of proof rule. You're asking them to give reasons for why they think that claim is legitimate. Because until they give reasons for their claim, they haven't offered an argument. And too often, Christians are responding to mere opinions and claims rather than arguments, and in essence, making their job as apologists much harder. And so whenever somebody would make a claim, the Christian somehow feels this obligation to respond to it. And so they're in essence putting themselves in the hot seat and making their job a lot more difficult and stressful. In reality, when I talk to non-believers, most often I'm just simply putting the ball back in their court where it belongs because they haven't offered an argument. They've just given a claim. And so my response is, really? What reasons do you have for thinking that's true? They'll tell me, well, the Bible's been, mistranslated. Really? How did you come to that conclusion? Joseph Smith is a Mormon. Really? Why should I believe that about? I'm sorry, Joseph Smith is a prophet of God. And I'll say, well, really? How did you come to that conclusion? Why would you think that's the case? And so this is far easier than trying to defend against every wild claim and idea that people can spin. And so that's why I'm such a big proponent of tactics in the faith, because it's not just giving people knowledge on a specific issue. It's teaching people how to carefully analyze statements and claims and arguments and being able to respond to them. And so tactics in defending the faith can be applied to any subject, whether you're talking about Islam or abortion or homosexuality or is Jesus the only way or the Bible's reliability or whatever. These tactics can be applied in any apologetic conversation. In fact, you could use them with your spouse, or your friends, or your parents, or whatever, So just be careful because sometimes they might pick up on that, Whenever I'm trying to make my case to persuade my wife on something, she'll stop and say, hey, don't use your apologetics on me, because she recognizes that I try to ask her questions that are very, tactics oriented. But again, I think this is critical. If people can learn to use questions and to learn these tactics, it can be applied to anything. And so you're really leveraging your education by learning one thing that can be applied to many subjects. That would really help.
All right. Well, it's definitely an excellent book, and I highly recommend it as well. So, Tactics by Greg Koukl. Now, as we wrap up, Alan, what sort of advice would you want to give to the next generation of Christian apologists?
Well, we've talked about, and I think you've mentioned this already, the concept of being an ambassador for Jesus Christ. And this is something that stands to reason is sort of our theme verse, 2 Corinthians 5:20, where the Apostle Paul tells the Corinthian church, he says, look, you are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making his appeal through you. And this idea is that, look, as Christians, wherever we go and speak to people, we ultimately reflect upon that person who we represent, and that is Jesus Christ. And so that makes me say, well, man, if everything I do and say ultimately reflects upon Jesus, what kind of person should I be like, especially as an apologist? And so at Stand to Reason, we say there's three key areas in which Christian apologists, the next generation, should really be focused at is this: knowledge, wisdom, and character. These are the three categories that I think are essential to being an effective ambassador, especially when it comes to Christian apologetics. So the first one, knowledge, is simply having the information, knowing the arguments. And many apologetics organizations are good at giving knowledge and equipping people with knowledge and the tools to be able to, have information to respond to people. But any ambassador, if you think of a political ambassador, it isn't going to be sufficient if they just have knowledge. What they also need to know is how to take that knowledge and deploy it in a way that is skillful, tactical, and fair and persuasive. And that's where wisdom comes in, the second category in being a good ambassador. Wisdom is being able to take the knowledge that we have and communicate it in a way that is persuasive and clear, using language that makes sense to the people, makes sense to the audience, right? So we want to avoid Christian lingo if we're talking to non-believers who aren't churched, But again, just having knowledge and having wisdom isn't going to complete the picture for being an effective ambassador. Because if we're knowledgeable and we're tactically wise, but we're jerks when we talk to people, we make people feel stupid, or if we're condescending, then our poor character will undermine our message. And that's where character comes in. And by character, I don't mean I want, the next generation of Christian apologists to be honest or people of the word, which, of course, that's assumed in in the word character. But what we mean by character is conversational character, meaning the manner in which we communicate should be kind, friendly, engaging, and gracious. And so that, when, you, Brian, walk into a conversation, you speak with a non-Christian and you walk away from that person, you want the non-Christian to say, man, talking to Brian, that was a really great conversation. He told me a lot of things about his faith that I never knew were actually true about his faith. And he really got me thinking. And you know what? He was so fun and friendly and kind. I just can't wait to talk to him again. And so we're leaving behind us this fragrant aroma that is enticing to non-believers, even though they may disagree with us. But they're thinking to themselves, hey, you know what? That person gave me something to think about. They put a stone in my shoe. And, there's something that now is kind of weighing on my mind that I want to think about. And the way we communicated it was gracious and kind. Now, don't get me wrong. I know that there's some topics that are going to be offensive to people, no matter how gracious and kind we are. I get that. I speak on abortion and homosexuality. And trust me, when I'm at a secular university audience, I know that I'm offensive no matter how I put it. But my point here is that we don't want to be unnecessarily offensive, right? Greg at Stand to Reason often says, the gospel is offensive enough. Don't add any more offense to it. But at the same time, we can't remove the offense that is inherent in the gospel, right? And so I think for this next generation of Christian apologists, it's critical that we don't just have knowledge, but we have to be able to take that knowledge and capture it in specific tactics that we can use on the street, but then have the character that allows us to communicate in a way that is warm and friendly and gracious, even if we're talking about things that are extremely controversial and offensive just by their very nature. And I think if we focus on that, I think as apologists we'll become far more effective, because not only will we be able to win the hearts and minds of people to Christ through the work of the Holy Spirit, but I believe we'll leave a lasting impression on our culture that Christians aren't just hate-filled bigots who are opposed to every moral thing, but in reality are people who are trying to communicate a very important message, and one that has, of course, eternal consequences.
Well, excellent. Alan, I want to thank you for joining me today. It's been great talking to you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I enjoyed it myself.
We've been speaking with Alan Shlemon of Stand to Reason, and you can find out more about his ministry at their website, str.org. And you'll also find links to Alan's resources on today's blog post at apologetics315.com. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, leave some feedback, and you can comment on today's blog post or leave a friendly review in iTunes or share it with a friend. This is Brian Oughton of Apologetics 315, and thanks for listening.